I want to say welcome to everybody. Do y'all see that it's recording?
Yes.
Okay. Welcome to everybody. I'm Andrea Cash. I help the League of Women Voters of North Carolina with their communications. We're glad you're here. We are recording this for our YouTube channel just in case anybody misses it. We want them to have the chance to see it later. We do encourage you, if you want to rename yourself so that we can just see what part of the state you're from, that would be fantastic. Try to keep yourselves on mute so that we can hear our presenters, and we like to keep things running on time around here. So with that, I will turn things over to Sandra Mal, who is with the League of Women Voters of North Carolina board.
Thank you, Andrea. Hi, I'm also a member of the League of Women Voters of Henderson County and co-chair of the Policing Practices Working Group. Members of the working group come from a number of local leagues across the state. Our working group was organized in June following the death of George Floyd as we contemplated the continuing racial inequities in our criminal justice system. Our organization's mission is to empower voters and defend democracy for everyone. We're striving to define and dissect all the issues that contribute to the continuing racial inequity we see in our criminal justice systems, but for these educational programs, we are looking at only one aspect: policing policies. Next slide, please. The League is governed by principles that include the belief that no person should suffer legal discrimination and that the government should be responsive to the will of the people. We also believe a democratic government depends upon the informed and active participation of its citizens. Next slide, please. In order for the League to take action on a public policy issue, the members of our organization must come to an understanding and agreement on that policy. We formed this working group as we realized there's no position at the national or state level that specifically addresses policing issues. And without that position, the League, as an organization, may not weigh in on any legislative solutions that could address these issues. There are lots of groups looking at police reform with a wide range of focus. We want to examine the intersection of community with their law enforcement agencies, and more specifically, the need for citizen input into the community impact of policing policies and the need for citizen oversight. But as all good leaguers do, the first step is to educate ourselves on what the current policies and practices are. Our final program next month is designed for League members to discuss the possibility of doing a consensus study or concurrence about policing practices in our state, and we'll share more details about that later tonight. Next slide, please. We're going to start with a quick poll question so we know who's in our audience tonight. So Andrea, if you can launch the poll, we'd like you to answer, if you like, the poll question: are you currently a member of the League of Women Voters? And we'd like to get a sense of how many folks are members and non-members as we've got out there. And reminder, while you're answering that, the League is open to women and men over the age of 16 who are interested in making a difference in their communities. And we'll put the link in the chat for more information on joining. So if everybody's had a chance to answer, we got about 80%, 88% of us here are members and 12% no. So again, we'll put some information in the chat if you're interested in learning further about us. We've got a packed program and expect to use the next hour to talk with you on what we've learned on oversight. And with that, I'll turn the floor over to Martha Robley, my co-chair of this working group and the unit coordinator for the Mid-Sound Hills member at large unit and fellow state board member. Martha.
Thank you, Sandra. Next slide, please, Andrea. Good evening, everyone. Why have oversight? Law enforcement institutions are entrusted with a diverse set of tasks requiring a high degree of integrity within the police agencies and their oversight. When this does not function well, law enforcement officers may become vulnerable to acting unlawfully or outside their remit. Holding police accountable ensure that they carry out their duties properly and are held responsible if they fail to do so. Such a system is meant to uphold police integrity, deter misconduct, and restore or enhance the public's confidence in policing. Oversight can involve a complementary system of both internal and external checks and balances, including oversight provided at the state level, internal oversight through reporting and disciplinary systems, and various models of civilian advisory or review boards. To give you information about each of these three oversight levels, we've divided the program into three parts. For the first part, Ernie Mall from our Henderson County League will describe the oversight provided by the two North Carolina Commissions on Education and Training, including a short interview with both of the directors. In the second section, you will hear an interview conducted by Kelly Fowler from our Asheville-Buncombe County League with Lieutenant Sorrells of the Asheville Police Department. And lastly, I will be facilitating a live panel discussion with three individuals who have had significant involvement with civilian oversight boards. I'll now turn it over to Ernie.
Thank you, Martha. And next slide, please. As we learned in our last two presentations, all law enforcement officers in North Carolina must be certified by either the Criminal Justice or Sheriff's Education and Training Standards Commissions. The commissions can take away those certifications in a variety of ways. Next slide, please. If the officers fail to keep up with their annual training, the commissions will suspend the certification until the officer gets back into compliance. If officers lose their employment for whatever reason, the commission is notified and certification is withdrawn. Now, what is the state's role in misconduct investigations? Next slide, please. Both commissions have probable cause committees that work similarly to investigate accusations against police officers. Misconduct cases can be referred to the commissions by the public, local agencies, prosecutors, or even other officers. The commissions will allow an agency's internal investigations to be completed before hearing a case, and if the accusations are criminal in nature, the committee waits for the results of the trial. Even if the charges are dropped, the officer is not indicted or found not guilty or not even fired, the commissions can and do look at the offense and the officer. The Probable Cause Committee meets quarterly and reports their findings and recommendations to the full commission. Staff investigators will present evidence. The accused officer can attend and bring an attorney, but the proceeding is purely administrative in nature. Next slide, please. Decisions and recommendations are sent to the full commission to be voted on, and recommendations can range from complete loss of certification or lesser sanctions, such as temporary suspension or written reprimand. Next slide, please. And Andrew, would you start the interview? We spoke with Directors Steve Combs and Diane Konopka to learn how the process continues.
So Director Combs, Director Konopka, your committees have found probable cause on an officer. What happens next?
Okay, I'll start off then. Once probable cause is found, the applicant or the officer is notified of that finding, and then that person has 30 days to request an administrative hearing to appeal that finding. If they do not request an administrative hearing, then the sanction that's stated in the rules for whatever their crime or their issue was becomes effective. An example of that would be that if they commit a serious Class B misdemeanor, then they would have a sanction of 5 years that they're out of law enforcement. But if the administrative hearing is properly requested, then the Office of Administrative Hearings is notified. They assign an administrative law judge and they schedule the hearing. The case is heard then by the administrative law judge, who then makes a recommendation that goes back to the full commission. And when I say the full commission, that's minus the PC members that heard the case to begin with. And then the commission hears a summary of that case and they render their final agency decision. Again, the only evidence that they can consider is what was presented at the hearing. And if the commission agrees with the initial finding, then the sanction that's stated in the rules may be imposed, or there could be some lesser or reduced sanction. Some examples might be that in the finding of a felony commission of an offense, that sanction is permanent and they cannot offer any lesser sanction. Or like if it was a charge maybe that took place out of state where the individual could have gotten more than 2 years imprisonment for it, that sanction is permanent. But for other violations such as a falsification or a misdemeanor conviction or commission, the commission may impose a lesser sanction than the 5 years that's stated in the rules. And that may be that they give them a lesser period of time that their certification is suspended or revoked or denied, or it may be that they allow them to work but put them on an extended probationary period where basically they're just sort of being tracked during that period of time. The only other thing I would mention there is that if the sheriff or chief that employs the individual or has some other knowledge of the case, then they must recuse themselves from any deliberations or any decisions in that matter.
And while the appeal process is going on, Are the officers allowed to be working?
Typically, yes, they are. They'll continue to work throughout the process until a final decision is made. Yes, sir.
Gotcha. Well, once again, thank you all for joining us. We appreciate it, and we'll talk with you soon.
Thank you very much.
So the Criminal Justice, thank you, Andrew. The Criminal Justice Commission minutes are posted on the Commission's website. The findings are posted, but the names of the officers involved are not listed. If an officer appeals a decision to a North Carolina Administrative Hearings Judge, then all records will become public. While the Sheriff's Commission minutes are public record, they're not posted on their website at this time. And finally, there is a national database tracking decertified officers that both North Carolina commissions participate in. And both directors tell us that they are working on a statewide database that will be open to the public. Now let's go to Kelly Fowler to learn about internal oversight.
Okay, next slide, please, Andrea. Thank you. So yes, internal oversight. This usually refers to a division within a police department. You may have heard it referred to as internal affairs, professional standards, inspector general, professional responsibility, etc., that investigates professional misconduct within the department. It's important because a robust and transparent internal oversight department in a local police department really strengthens the bond between community and police. And there are three really main functions. One is to protect the public, which must be assured that any misconduct will be thoroughly investigated and adjudicated in order to prevent further harm to the public. To protect the department, which is itself protected when the community has faith that all misconduct will be thoroughly investigated, but also is protected when bad policing is corrected and when policies are updated to prevent and correct misconduct. And finally, to protect the employee. This really can only be done through thorough investigations. Next slide, Andrea. Thank you. So as mentioned, we're going to see an interview conducted with Lieutenant Sorrells, who heads the Office of Professional Responsibility of the Asheville Police Department. But before we start that interview, I just want to give some context to some of the things that you'll hear come up in the interview. Lieutenant Sorrells talks about possible outcomes to an investigation. These are unfounded, which is the allegation is demonstrably untrue, sorry about that, exonerated, which means the incident did occur but was proper or lawful. Not sustained means that there is insufficient evidence to prove or disprove the allegation. Sustained is the allegation is supported by evidence. And policy failure. This is when the allegation is true and the action was within policy. This usually suggests that the policy needs to be reviewed and possibly amended. Some of the corrective actions that can come out of these investigations are informal and might include coaching or referral to an employee assistance program, for example, and others are more formal, which can include documented verbal warnings, written warnings, suspension without pay, and termination. So with that background, we can start the video. Please, Andrea.
Hello, Lieutenant Sorrells. Thank you for joining us today to talk about our session on internal police oversight. Before we get started with the questions, can you tell our audience how long you've been with the Asheville Police Department and what your current role is?
Sure. Good morning. Thanks for having me. My name is Lieutenant Joey Sorrells. Like she said, I'm with Asheville Police Department. I've been here just a little over 23 years now. And my current assignment is in our professional standards section.
Great. So you're the perfect person to talk to about internal police review for our audience. Could you please provide a general overview of Asheville Police Department's internal review standards, such as what types of incidents, how are they reported for review?
Sure. So some of the issues that we review and investigate or look at, of course, all of the use of force reports are reviewed. Vehicle pursuits are reviewed as well. All departmental motor vehicle accidents are reviewed. Citizen complaints are reviewed, and then also internal incidents that are generated in-house by other employees or something that has came up internally. All of those are reviewed as well.
Are there any incidents that require automatic review,
So
regardless of who reports it, for instance?
Sure. Well, use of force generates an automatic review. Vehicle pursuits are reviewed automatically, and then also department motor vehicle crashes. Those are all automatically reviewed by us in professional standards.
Great, thank you. Can you outline the general process for review, and that would include the chain of command?
Okay. So once an incident or event, whether it's a citizen complaint, a crash, a use of force, has been generated, once that is determined to be need to be reviewed, then it's sent to our office here in professional standards, and then the review process starts, and that is body worn camera footage is reviewed, officer statements, witness statements. Is there physical evidence of of whatever the allegation is we're reviewing? Interviews that are conducted, other surveillance cameras, really much like a criminal investigation. So we kind of investigated on that same level, trying to gather as much information as we can.
Great.
And then as far as the chain of command review, that is done at each level. So like I'm a lieutenant, so from this office, it will go to a captain for review. That captain can weigh in on the investigation and make comments and sends it to the deputy chief. Then the deputy chief weighs in and sends it to the chief, and then ultimately the chief has the final say so on it.
And are there other agencies that might play a role in these reviews, such as state agencies or federal agencies?
If it's something that rises, could potentially rise to the level of a criminal investigation, then of course the district attorney's office is notified, and then also at his or her request, the SBI could be called in to investigate as well. If there's some type of federal violation, civil rights violation, something like that, then the FBI could look into it. Primarily what we deal with would be the district attorney looking at it and asking the SBI to investigate as well.
I see. And can you help us understand the range of possible responses to these reviews?
So there are several outcomes from a review. The allegation, and we're strictly looking at it from our standpoint here at Asheville Police Department from a policy viewpoint. Was a policy violated or not? So that allegation can be sustained, it can be non-sustained, it can be unfounded. That can also be classified as a policy failure. Sorry. So those are some of the outcomes that could come of an investigation.
I see. Thank you. And how does the officer's experience and judgment play into the review process? Or so are there different actions for the same type of incident depending on the tenure and history of the officer?
So every situation is different. Even though they could be very similar of the same policy violation that we're looking at, each situation is going to be a little bit different. So, I would say those things are taken into a little bit of consideration, but at the end of the day, we're looking at, was a policy violated? And if so, that's what we need to address and to deal with. As far as their tenure and being a young officer and a new officer, we understand that the officers are going to make mistakes. Newer officers sometimes tend to make more mistakes than seasoned officers. But at the end of the day, part of their training, when they become a solo officer, they should be familiar with policies and procedures that we have in place here. So again, our review, our investigation, that's what we're looking at is, was a policy violated? Now, where it can come into play is if a policy is determined to be violated, the chief has agreed with that and recommended some type of corrective action. If it's a younger officer and it's their first first time, of violating this particular policy or something similar to this, then they may get a lower level of corrective action. If it's a seasoned officer and this is his or her second, third, fourth time violating a policy similar to this or doing something similar, then that discipline can be progressive and be more severe at each time after, each time that they commit the policy violation.
Understood. And is there a proactive intervention system to help prevent issues?
Yeah, part of our software that we use here, we have built in an early warning system, and we can set the parameters, whether it's 3 incidents in a 12-month period or 2 or 5 or whatever we want to set the threshold at. But we can set that threshold, and if an officer hits that threshold, then it does trigger an early intervention warning. And then once that is triggered and activated, then we go back and we'll review the incidents that officer has been involved in and determine, is there some training that we need to do? What can we do to fix this if it is a problem?
And can you help us understand the timeliness of these investigations? Are these conducted in a timely manner, these investigations?
Yes, we have built into our policy. We try to have these wrapped up in about 60 days is what we try to have them completed in. Which some things do take a little longer than 60 days, and there's a request for an extension process. There are a process that's in place to request that extension. Has to be approved by the chief, and then we also have to notify the complainant if it's going to extend beyond that 60 days as well. So we try to keep everyone informed, but also try to get it wrapped up in a timely manner.
Great. And are the investigations reviewed or audited by others within the department? Are there outside agencies?
No, they aren't. They aren't reviewed or audited. Officers' personnel files are private, so they aren't subject to be reviewed by outside agencies. We have the internal review process through the chain of command. And that's kind of how we vet it and ensure accuracy and fairness and consistency.
Well, that's a great lead into the next question, which is how does your department communicate with the public regarding the resolution of these issues, whether the personnel portion, there's a lot of talk about releasing body cam footage, for instance.
Right, so as far as release, if you're the complainant and it's a citizen complaint, and if you're the complainant, you have filed a complaint on me. Once that investigation is completed, then whoever would be in this position that I'm in now would send you a letter saying that the investigation has been completed, and then it cites North Carolina personnel law that says basically we can't tell you what happened, whether it was sustained or not sustained or anything like that, unless the officer is demoted or fired or suspended more than 10 days, I believe it is. Then that could become public information at that point. But if you file a complaint on me and it's investigated in the letter that you get, it basically says that the investigation has been complete, and assures you that a thorough and accurate investigation was conducted. However, the findings of it are confidential and not for release, unless that officer fired or terminated or something.
Thank you. And under what circumstances would body cam footage be released?
A court order. A judge can authorize when body camera is released, and it can be, certainly as part of the trial. If it's going to court, body camera footage can come into play there. And also, if it's in the best interest of the public, then we can petition for the courts to release some body camera footage.
Understand. Thank you. And the last question is, if you have an officer who's terminated for cause, what are the mechanisms across North Carolina and across other states for reporting that?
So for us in North Carolina, it would be if an officer is terminated, or if an officer resigns on their own accord, retirement or anything, we fill out what is called a Form F5B. And that goes to North Carolina Training and Standards, which is the certifying entity for law enforcement officers in North Carolina. So we fill out that form when someone has separated from the department. And on there, it's listed, was it a retirement or resignation, termination? And then there's a section on there where if it's obviously a termination, where we have to list the details of that termination. That is sent through Training and Standards in Raleigh. They will review it. So if that person ever applies to be an officer in North Carolina, then they have that and they can look at it and review it and say, we're going to revoke this person's certification. He or she's not suitable to be an officer in North Carolina, or they could suspend their certification for a certain amount of time. But that's up to Training and Standards, and they do get notified of that on that F5B form and review those when those come through.
Great. Well, Lieutenant Searles, I want to thank you again for helping us understand some of the considerations that go into an internal review process. Thank you again.
You're welcome. And yearly we provide a professional standards report, and it details all of the use of force and vehicle pursuits and a lot of the internal complaints, the numbers and stats, and that is published on the city's website, on the police department's website, and that's done every year. So we try to post that and be as transparent as we can.
Oh, fantastic. I think people would appreciate knowing that. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
And thank you, Andrea, and back to Martha.
Yep. Thank you. In many communities in the U.S., including North Carolina, residents participate to some degree in overseeing their local law enforcement agencies. In doing so, though, it seems that no two civilian oversight agencies are identical, as each community has its own political, social, and cultural tensions that influence the authority and the organizational structure of the oversight agency. To help us sort out all of this, we have a panel of 3 individuals who have significant experience with civilian oversight. I am pleased to introduce Cameron McElhinney, the Director of Training and Education for the National Association for Civilian Oversight of Law Enforcement, or commonly known as NACOL. As Director of Training and Education, Cameron plays a leading role in designing, coordinating, delivering, and evaluating local, regional, and national training programs. She also provides support to oversight practitioners and advocates across the country. Cameron first became involved in civilian oversight in the late 90s when she was a member of the Indianapolis Citizens Police Complaint Board, including serving 2 years as its president. Our second panelist is LaBecky Rowe. She's been involved in many endeavors in the Charlotte community, including the Charlotte Citizens Review Board, the Mecklenburg County Sheriff Citizen Academy, the Charlotte Mecklenburg Police Department Citizens Academy, and the Charlotte Black Political Caucus. She has a master's degree in criminal justice and was a patrol officer with the NYPD. Recently, LaBecky founded the nonprofit Let's Talk About It, the Autism Center, and co-hosts a weekly radio program. Our last panelist is David Bland. David is a member of the Raleigh Police Advisory Board and has chaired a task force for the reform of bail bonding in North Carolina. He's also a member of the Wake County League and a life member of the NAACP. David has a doctorate in education, and his working experience includes Commissioner of Prisons and Jails for the state of Kentucky. Our panel discussion will last approximately a half an hour. Each panelist will be given no more than 3 minutes to respond to my questions. At the end of the discussion, each panelist will be given 3 minutes to make closing remarks. Al Robley from the Mid-Sand Hills MAL unit will act as timekeeper. I will hold up a yellow card for a 30-second warning, and then at the end of the 3 minutes, I will hold up a red card for stop. So let's begin with the panel discussion. My first question is for LaBecky and David. Tell us about your respective civilian police review board, including how many members, how are they appointed, what is the board mandated to do, and how is a complaint against the police department filed? Again, each of you have 3 minutes to respond. We'll start with David and then LaBecky. David?
I have had the pleasure of being on the Citizens Review Board or Advisory Board in Raleigh. It was formed back last October by the Raleigh City Council. It was an effort by a group in Raleigh for several years to gain such a citizen review board. One of the major issues facing the board was whether it would have subpoena power or not. The city council did not agree to do that. The chief of police was not supportive of that idea. That has some pluses and minuses to it. So I would suggest to anyone who is considering an advisory board for their municipality that they consider very specifically for the board to have such a right. The board is comprised of 10 individuals. They serve a 2-year term and may be reestablished in the board for 3 different times. There are 2 alternates, and it is from that group of alternates that a board member would be replaced should they have to resign or leave town or whatever for that reason. The board is extremely important in terms of where we are now as a society. There are increasing needs for transparency and better understanding between the community and the board and the police department, especially as we are facing more and more of the demonstrations and protests in our municipalities. There is a critical issue in terms of use of force, and that is an area where the advisory board, I think, is going to have a major impact on the relationship between the police department or law enforcement in general, be it the sheriff or the police department, how they are to be dealt with and reflected appropriately and positively to the community.
Thank you, David. LeBecky?
As a new member of the Citizens Review Board, I do know that the board was established in June of 1997, and there are 11 members. 3 of them are appointed by the mayor, 3 are appointed by the city manager, and the rest are appointed, the other 5, excuse me, are appointed by the city council. The term is a 3-year term. You can do 2 terms only. We meet once a month on a Tuesday. Some of the things that we oversee are actions regarding alleged violation of use of force, unbecoming conduct of a police officer, search and seizure, arrest, arbitrary profiling.
Thank you. My next question is for Cameron. Cameron, please describe for us what NACOL views as a meaningful civilian oversight. And again, you have 3 minutes to respond. Cameron?
Thanks, Martha. So civilian oversight by definition is the independent, external, and ongoing review of a law enforcement agency and its operations outside of the law enforcement agency being overseen. It should be given, an oversight agency should be given the authority to provide oversight in an independent manner and the resources to meet its prescribed mandates. In the best of all possible scenarios, and I realize we don't always live in a world where we have the best of all possible scenarios, we recommend that authority be given to carry out functions such as independent investigation of complaints alleging officer misconduct, auditing or monitoring various aspects of the overseen law enforcement agency, analyzing patterns, trends, and activity, issuing public reports, and issuing recommendations on things like discipline, training, procedures, and policies. However, we know that this long list is not always possible in all communities, whether it's because of existing laws, city budgets, or political will. In the end, meaningful oversight promotes greater law enforcement accountability, increased transparency, positive organizational change, and improved responsiveness to community needs and concerns. I would also say that when developing an oversight agency or enhancing those that already exist, it's important to consider the principles of oversight. Building effective oversight requires balancing and prioritizing these principles based on what stakeholders determine to be the most important for the community the agency serves. And when I say stakeholders, I mean, it's not just community members, it's elected officials, it's the law enforcement agency themselves. There's a larger group of stakeholders that this all works for. These principles include independence, clearly defined and adequate jurisdictional authority, access to records and facilities, and in many cases, we'd actually say unfettered access, but I know that laws in place often inhibit that ability to have unfettered access to records and facilities. Access to law enforcement executives and internal affairs staff, full cooperation, which is, I'll just add, is very necessary for obtaining the sufficient amount of information needed to do the work that's performed or for an agency to meet its mandate. Substantiated stakeholder support is another principle, along with adequate funding and operational resources, public reporting and transparency, policy and patterns and practice analysis, community outreach, community input, confidentiality, anonymity, and fear, and being able to do it without fear of retaliation. And lastly, procedural justice and legitimacy. And adherence to these principles must take into consideration things such as community needs, local legislation, and the size of the law enforcement agency. And I'll leave it there, Martha. Thank you. I told you I'd try to be a woman of fewer words. I'll give it another go next time.
No, I appreciate it. Thank you. My next question is actually posed to all of you. Ask you to give us your perspective on what a relationship between a community and its law enforcement looks like and why you think it's essential. And again, the limit is 3 minutes for each response. I'll start with Lebecky this time, followed by David, and then lastly, Cameron. Lebecky.
In order for a police department to make a difference in the neighborhood in which they serve, they have to go into that neighborhood and speak to the stakeholders. Who are the stakeholders in the community? Some of the stakeholders are the leaders of grassroots organizations, right? We have pastors, we have business owners, we have the principals at schools. We also have those social workers, school social workers that work in the neighborhood, right? And in some neighborhoods, you have neighborhood watchmen. So you have those people who are always on the street and they see and they know what's going on in their neighborhood. We may have that mother or that grandmother who's looking out her window, constantly watching what's going on in that neighborhood. They have to work collectively and collaboratively, right? To assess the needs of the community. That's what we have to do. We have to work together. The police, the stakeholders have to meet each other where they are. We can't pass judgment, or we can't have biases, right? Relationships are built on a mutual respect and trust for the betterment of the neighborhood that they all have a stake in enhancing.
Thank you, Lebecky. David, same question.
Well, I think several things. First of all, when an advisory board is even contemplated, it should be an interaction between the city council, if that's the agency that's doing the creation, and the community itself. And as the city council begins formulating what that entity is going to look like, what its charter is going to be, what its priorities are going to be, they really need to reflect the input and emphasis which the public group has brought to them to even make them consider having a citizens advisory board. Second thing is that even though the officers are interacting with the community on a daily basis, the Citizens Advisory Board has a truly unfettered and greater opportunity to come to understand what some of the concerns are in that neighborhood that maybe the law enforcement group really is not conscious of. That needs to be a focus of the board and be a part of the interaction and the interface that it has with the police department. Third thing is that it's absolutely essential that the police department does not see the advisory board as an adversary. They have to see that board as a feed. We are not only reflect to them what we are learning from the community, but we're also there to say to the community, here are the concerns that law enforcement has, and they're trying to address them. How can you help them achieve this? Finally, the greatest area of difficulty, as I see it, is rising up to the whole issue of the use of force. And I'm not talking about what happened to George Floyd. That is just unconscionable. But what I am talking about is when a group goes to demonstrate and it's very peaceful and proper, but as time passes, things start falling apart. And when they fall apart, that's when the law enforcement group has got its greatest challenge in terms of how to deal with that without overextending the use of force.
Thank you, David. Cameron? Sorry. Cameron?
Okay, there we go.
Yeah.
As I know that everyone on this Zoom is already aware, there are many traditional aspects of law enforcement that create pinch points in some places and serious points of contention in others with the community. In order to build a relationship with communities, particularly those where no relationship currently exists, there needs to be a move to a culture where transparency and accountability are valued within the law enforcement agency. I realize that this requires a complete culture shift in some instances because of the us versus them mentality that has come to permeate law enforcement. And it does permeate communities. That has bled over where many believe it's an us versus them situation. Civilian oversight of law enforcement is a critical facet of any well-founded effort to strengthen the relationship between law enforcement and communities and to build public trust, all while promoting effective policing. I think it's important to remember that civilian oversight alone will not solve all of the issues that plague law enforcement and the criminal justice system as a whole. I mean, there is a lot of work to be done there. However, without it, it'll be more difficult, if not impossible, for law enforcement to maintain or gain the public's trust and achieve meaningful, sustainable reform. In many cities where we've seen effective, sustainable oversight models, we have begun to see a shift in this culture. It's sometimes painfully slow, but it is there, and it's creating models where police are safer because the community trusts them, and the community has an avenue for bringing forth complaints when that trust is broken. This builds a healthier, safer community where people are more likely to report crimes because they see officers who show that they are there for them and not just working against them.
Thank you. My last question is also for all of you. What steps can a community take to establish effective police oversight? This time we'll start with you, Cameron, then LeBecky, and lastly, David. Cameron.
Thanks. I would be remiss and probably reprimanded by my bosses if I didn't start by saying that NACOL helps cities all over the country in establishing and enhancing civilian oversight mechanisms. Since the beginning of June alone, we've assisted well over 100 cities across the country, both small and large, providing everything from advice and resources to more in-depth information and training for the specific circumstances of that community. So there's no one-size-fits-all approach to police oversight. There are approximately 175 entities across the United States that are established by ordinance, executive order, or through city charter amendments. And as was mentioned earlier by you, I believe, Martha, no two are alike. There are civilian review boards, there's auditors and monitors, there's inspector generals, there's investigative models, along with a whole list of hybrid mechanisms. The best approach continues to be a subject of debate. But in part, this is because so many different factors influence what particular agencies and communities need and can actually sustain. So to create a new civilian oversight mechanism or to negotiate or reorganize an existing one, communities must first consider a series of questions and make some key decisions. And this includes things like, who will I need to bring together in my community to begin the process? What outcomes do I hope to achieve by establishing civilian oversight? How should the oversight mechanism be structured? What resources will it need? What information should be gathered and analyzed that allows us to better understand the police misconduct and need for continued accountability? What information should you gather to measure your agency's impact? Because that's a huge question often, is how can you prove that this actually does anything? What steps will be taken to communicate and engage with the community that will allow continued understanding of not only their needs, but law enforcement's in the process. And I think maybe the most important question or thing to consider is, what challenges will the new or improved agency need to address in the short term, right now? And what challenges will there be in the near term, or will they be ongoing? Will some challenges just never go away? And how can you address those? Also, it's important to think about the opportunities that exist for the agency to advance its mission and provide effective oversight.
Thank you, Cameron. LeBecky?
I don't know if she got booted from the meeting, but I don't see
no.
her anymore.
Uh-oh. All right, let's, David, I'll go to you, and maybe hopefully LeBecky gets reconnected. You need to unmute, please, David.
Okay.
Thank you.
In my opinion, because of the social unrest which we have experienced this year, due to really some egregious actions on the part of law enforcement, and the difficulty that law enforcement is having in terms of trying to figure out how best do I interface with this horde of people coming downtown, in some instances doing violence to personal property. How is it that I interface with that group? And because of that, that's the reason Carmen has got so many startups since June. Towns and cities are really worried and distraught over how they can bring about a better understanding and a mutual respect between the general community that is really aggrieved. And we have to admit that the communities that are demonstrating really aggrieved group of people. But from all of that, at least in Raleigh, our advisory board bubbled up from an informal group of citizens who were really concerned about the very things that I just mentioned. And it was out of that our board was finally created. We are certainly going through some learning steps now, and I think we're going to go through some substantive changes as we gain more experience and credibility as a board.
Thank you, David. I think LeBecky has rejoined us, Andrea.
Yes.
Okay.
Hello, I apologize for my internet.
No, that's okay. We always say it's technology, right? I'm glad you got back in. Thank you, LeBecky. We were on the last question, which is what steps can a community take in establishing effective police oversight?
Community stakeholders can come together to assess and identify the needs and resources that are present and begin to communicate with police, community teams to find ways to address the needs. Building relationships is always a first step. Finding commonalities and building consensus around ways to address community problems and needs.
Okay. Thank you. We now have 3 minutes for each of you to make closing remarks. And I'll start with David this time first, then Cameron, and then LeBecky. David? Need to unmute again. I'm sorry, David.
First of all, I want to thank you all for having me on this as panel, and the fact that you have seen the issue of policing, law enforcement, and the interface with the community as such a critical ingredient. I would suggest to you that as you expand your area of investigation and additive knowledge, that you take into account the governor's task force on racial equity and criminal justice. They are doing some incredible work. Their report is going to be released on December the 15th, and they are looking at many of the issues which we talked about tonight. In addition, they're looking at what is the appropriate role of, if there is one, of the SROs. They are looking at the question of how communities and law enforcement really can come together. And I know that they've had some discussion about advisory boards or commissions. So I would suggest that when that report comes out, that you get a copy of it. It will be online. Get a copy of it and take a look at the recommendations that they've made, because I think there are some really substantive issues that they have developed, and it's an incredible group. It really is.
Great, thank you. Cameron?
So I also want to thank you very much for having me today. I'm honored to have been invited and to also share space on the panel with LeBecky and David. So I want to close out by saying we have an opportunity right now to establish effective and sustainable oversight throughout the United States. I mean, we've been working on establishing oversight since the 1920s. It's taken a long time to get to where we are. And it is so great to have everybody at the party now where people are paying attention. We have an opportunity to demand that all oversight established through ordinance or charter amendment so that it cannot be subjected to future political whims. We have the opportunity to make sure that it has the resources and authority to thrive and provide the platform for real sustainable change. We need more oversight mechanisms than the ones we already have. There are approximately 18,000 law enforcement agencies. We need to make sure that whether a department has 35,000 officers or 5, there's a mechanism in which misconduct is investigated, addressed, and policies changed to better serve the community as a whole. With well over 750,000 sworn members of law enforcement throughout the country, by the way, the majority of which I truly believe are good people who became members of law enforcement for the right reasons, we need to make sure that they're employed in an environment that promotes a collaborative culture, constitutional policing, and training that de-emphasizes the need for use of force and emphasizes de-escalation techniques. And we need to make sure it's an environment where officers are part of a community that they understand and come to truly serve and protect. And this is just the start of my list, but I know Martha's going to hold up the 30-second sign if I go on for too long. But civilian oversight is a mechanism that can help move us towards that. So I really appreciate all of you taking the time to learn more. And I would also say, I'll try to put it in the chat box once I'm done speaking, is that we also have a Civilian Oversight 101 training video that gives you more information on the types of models, the principles that I very briefly mentioned earlier, and some more information as well. So I'll add in the chat box, and it would be great if, and all of our contact information is all over the website. So if anybody has any follow-up questions, please let me know.
Thank you, thank you. And LeBecky, please.
I also thank you all for this opportunity. In a perfect world, I see the relationship between law enforcement and the community as one of collaboration. Based on the motto of the NYPD, the job of law enforcement is to protect and serve. To me, that means that the police are supposed to follow the laws, be present in and represent the communities in which they serve. They should work to build relationships with community leaders, as community leaders should work to build relationship with law enforcement. Identifying where problems exist and work together to address the problems. When problems are addressed and managed and solved, everyone gets to celebrate the victory. There should be a relationship of mutual respect and integrity.
Everyone wins.
Yep.
Yes, it's a win-win.
May I make one other recommendation to the group?
Yes, David.
An area that and Cameron, maybe this is something you could really focus on and speak to, but one of the real huge deficits that we have in law enforcement interfacing with the community across this nation is the fact that we do not have any information transfer between agencies across the state. And I can be in Tennessee and hire a law enforcement officer that's guilty of homemade sin back in North Carolina, and I'd never know about it. That's crazy. And it's not going to be resolved until we have citizens involved calling for it, because law enforcement agencies, especially the police departments, are well protected with their, what do you call them, unions or professional organizations. So it is a great need.
Okay, thank you for the, and I thank everybody, all of our panelists. It was great, and I found it extremely informative. I hope our participants did. And I also wanted to let everybody know that we're putting links in the chat room to each of our panelists' respective organizations, so you can get more information about their organizations. I will now turn it back to Sandra for closing remarks and an invitation to our last program. Sandra.
Thanks, Martha. And I want to add my thanks to our panelists and also to my fellow working group members who have contributed their time and talents to these last 4 programs that we've presented on policing practices in North Carolina. I know we have come away with a greater understanding of the current practices and have generated some ideas for improvement in our state. We've uncovered lots of resources, which we've shared with you as our programs have gone along, and everyone registered for tonight's program will receive an email with some resources on the subject of oversight for you to learn more about that. And we do, as David mentioned, we do expect the report in December from the Governor's Task Force on Racial Equity and Criminal Justice, and we'll be monitoring any legislation that might make its way through our State House. And we're going to host our last program on Thursday, December 17th, for league members to discuss the possibilities for forming a position that would help us advocate for or against any proposed legislation. And we're putting the information in there in the chat for you to register while you're thinking about it if you want to join us in December. We've invited members from leagues in St. Louis and in California to share their experiences with us and their experiences in adopting criminal justice positions. And we'll allow plenty of time for our league members to have their say on what they think their priorities should be going forward, because we haven't had any time in these 4 programs, but our 5th one is going to be all about that, about you being able to share your opinions. So a reminder, it's for the member delegates at the 2021 League of Women Voters of North Carolina Convention to agree or not on pursuing a public policy position on policing practices. And we want to provide a platform for some feedback on that issue for our members at the December meeting. And I think we're done with we can stop the recording, and we don't